And welcome back to part 2 of What is an IMD by Access California. My name is Claire Courtwright. I am the Policy Director for Cal Voices, which is Access California is a program of Cal Voices. So in part 1 of this podcast series, I went very briefly and without too much nuance over the issue of what is an institution for mental disease, why it matters, and why it is such a hot topic politically in California and across the country with respect to homelessness, substance use, and mental health disorders. So in part 1 of the podcast, I briefly addressed this issue of institutionalization and the meaning of housing and the options for housing and the payers for housing for people with mental health disabilities, but also substance use disorders. And so, this meaning of housing has always been a core issue at the heart of what we call deinstitutionalization, or getting folks out of state hospitals as a way to meet their needs. So obviously in the past, our primary form of caring for people with serious mental illness was to place them in state institutions, in large hospitals where all of this person's needs were supposed to be met. Obviously didn't happen, total house of horrors. But those large locked institutions were integrated in the sense that it's a one-stop shop, right? You have food, clothing, shelter, psychiatric care, various forms of, social rehabilitation. But in the main, they were a form of warehousing people. And as medications got better for the treatment of mental illness and as attitudes changed, states moved away, and California moved away from the state hospital system as the means by which we would meet needs. And the state hospital system was fully state funded, and it was expensive. And I think there's a myth that that was the primary motivation for Ronald Reagan and the Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act in the late 60s that pared back the dependence on state hospitals as a form of care. It's a myth, but an important point nonetheless. They are very expensive. It's a very expensive form of care. And so there's this idea of housing is not just where are you going to live, but it was also highly related to segregation. Right. One of the core objections to having state hospitals or having facilities, care facilities in which people with serious mental illness will live is that they are segregated from society. They're marked, they're set apart. And so it's really size, over 16 beds, if you watch podcast 1, but also this issue of segregation. Segregation in care facilities. Those are two core components of deinstitutionalization. We don't want to segregate people. We especially don't want to segregate them in large care facilities. But deinstitutionalization in California, the moving away from the dependence on state hospitals into more community-based care and housing outside of a care facility, it didn't eliminate that, right? So deinstitutionalization in California did not eliminate institutionalization. It just narrowed it. It made it so that fewer people could be subject to that particular intervention. And it narrowed that intervention to persons who are first conserved. So in order to be long-term institutionalized in a state hospital or a private IMD, requires a conservatorship first. We still have conservatorships. We still have people who have been living for decades in state-funded, state-run, state hospitals. Many of those hospitals are in continuous operations since before deinstitutionalization, like Napa State Hospital in Napa. And conservatorships have always had an important component to them, which is the court can order where you're going to live. The conservator, the court have the legal jurisdiction to make that housing placement, and where you are placed does not involve your choice. It is involuntary. And those conservatorships are necessary as a first step before you can be placed in a long-term locked institutionalization situation. But you're also subject to being placed into housing without your choice on an outpatient basis with a conservatorship, right? So you can be conserved and not put in a state hospital or a private locked IMD long term. You can also be, placed in an unlocked facility or even an apartment or something like that, but it's still not your choice. It's still under a court order, and someone else is making that choice for you. And then, as I mentioned in part one of the podcast, so deinstitutionalization narrowed it so that you had to first be conserved before you could be placed long term in a locked facility like a state hospital. And specifically, the criteria from deinstitutionalization was that the person, because of a serious mental illness, would be unable to provide for their own food, clothing, and shelter. That was it. Not that you're incompetent, simply that you cannot be self-supporting, and relatedly that you don't have any family who can support you, called third-party support. So a core part of all of this too has always been, where is the social safety net for people with disabilities who can't work or are not welcome in the workplace, or who cannot work to a degree to be self-sustaining in a inflating economy and housing market. And the hook for conservatorships has always been that inability to provide for your own food, clothing, and shelter. So that's what can land you in long-term institutionalization, is really a disability and indigence, poorness. And then short-term institutionalization, the ability to place people in locked IMDs without going through the due process and court process to be conserved first. We just call those psychiatric holds. So when states are expanding the reasons why you can be conserved and the number of people who can be conserved, and they are building locked facilities, and they are doing all of the same for the quote unquote short-term institutionalization, psychiatric holds, longer and longer holds, more holds for more reasons, also which place you in locked IMDs. You can see that there really is, in the strictest sense, a reinstitutionalization movement going on. Everything that is being altered or being sought to be altered are pieces of deinstitutionalization. And so I think sometimes the community is treated as if they're hysterical that the institutions are coming back, but quite literally, all of the pieces of deinstitutionalization have been questioned and are being dismantled to some degree. And then, enter stage left, we also have this new form, this new vehicle of the ability of a court and a county, essentially, to place someone into involuntary housing, but on a much lower legal standard than a conservatorship. Whether or not that is constitutional is a really good question, but people don't really sue on behalf of this community. It's a very underserved legally community. And so we have this whole other vehicle that could also, place folks into unlocked IMDs under a civil outpatient commitment order like care court. So that's a whole new kind of wrinkle to this scenario. And so, when this community is evaluating housing, right? Any piece of policy that relates to funding of housing, building of housing for people with serious mental illness or SUD, we're always asking, is this bucket of money, is this housing money, is it for voluntary housing? Or is it to offset the costs of conserving people and placing them in facilities? Is the housing we're talking about, is it a care facility or a real place to live? So on top of, is it your choice or do you have any say in the matter? It's also, is this segregation? Is this warehousing? Is this just putting our people away, and not allowing them to even the opportunity to grow and change and have a journey in their lives and self-direction and goals? Um, the other thing that we ask when we look at, pots of money that are for housing or IMD policy placements for folks, we also ask, is it forever? Right. So this goes back to, if you watch podcast one, it may be that at a particular point in someone's recovery journey or relapse, they may need some subsidized place to live. They may need some additional supports in order to get to the next place that they want to go. But when you are using conservatorships or outpatient civil commitment orders, to place folks into facilities, we're also looking at the length of those orders and whether the place that you are, being put, is supposed to be your forever place. And now I just want to turn to something that really needs to be questioned and you see in the media all the time related to these issues of, are we going back to institutions? Yes, in some respects, you can't deny it because all of the pieces of deinstitutionalization have been, directly altered or attempted to be altered. And when these conversations are happening at the state level or even nationally, you will often hear that, back before we shut the state hospitals, which is not what happened. But back before we shut the state hospitals, how many people with disabilities were impacted by this state hospital system, by institutionalization? And according to this KQED article I found, they said the number of patients in the California state hospitals peaked at 37,000 in 1959. So that's a snapshot in time, right? People did actually come and go out of the state hospitals. So it's kind of like taking a snapshot of a jail population. But this is a snapshot in time. And in 1959, at one point in time at the snapshot, it was affecting 37,000 people. And now you can go look and see, well, now that you understand what an IMD is, that they may be locked or unlocked, they are over 16 beds. They are facilities primarily for treating mental illness or SUD. And you can go look and see, how many of these does California have? It's publicly available information, and you can add up the beds. And I did. And so there's about, according to this document, and if I transferred it to an Excel spreadsheet appropriately, there's about 14,000, a little over 14,000 IMD beds in California. So at any given point in time, if those beds are full, you're affecting about 14,000 people with, some form of institutionalization, which does scuttle the voluntary, involuntary a little bit, but institutions, about 14,000. But then there are sort of shadow institutions that are very much affecting policy and have come into the limelight. And this is a story from, I think, about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago. And it was a piece of investigative journalism by LEU. And what it is talking about is the fact that a lot of folks with serious mental illness have been placed in nursing homes. And as the place that they will live, as the place that they will receive all of their care, their mental health care, their physical health care, their food. And so there is kind of a shadow institutionalized population or shadow IMD population in California that's fairly large, apparently. I mean, according to this report, there were 22,000 nursing home residents that had serious mental illness. And again, and part of this investigative journalism was like, well, are they old, right? Are they in a nursing home because they're elderly and they need assisted living? or are they in a nursing home because this is where they're being placed in the absence of a robust continuum and um, appropriate housing placements for the variety of people in their variety of needs. And it's a really good story. I suggest everyone read it. And it does say that a lot of these people are younger. They're probably not primarily in need of nursing care. They're also being placed in regular nursing homes as opposed to what's called special treatment programs that are specially licensed programs for people that have that dual need of nursing care, but also nursing home care, but also a serious mental illness. And of course, this has resulted in a lot of catastrophe. But, you know, at any given point in time, right, there might be, in addition to these 14,000 beds, there might be another 22,000 people essentially in things that are IMDs, locked or unlocked. And so, you know, that snapshot of institutionalization, you're already at, you know, about 37,000, what it was at the height of institutionalization in California. And it also bears mentioning, it is not good, but it is also a problem. And it bears mentioning that our jail system has also become a shadow institutionalization, shadow institutions. And how that's happening primarily is that folks with serious mental illness are charged with a crime. Sometimes that crime is petty, sometimes it's a misdemeanor. Um, and there is a criminal procedure by which their defense attorney can do what's called raise a doubt in their case, which is essentially say, hey, okay, I've talked to my client, they're charged with this crime, but I believe that they're mentally ill and that they are not currently able to assist in their own defense, understand the nature and charges against the nature of the charges against them and the consequences. I don't think they're in a place mentally to be able to, you know, plead in a criminal case or make a decision like I'm going to plead guilty, I'm going to not plead guilty. So what ends up happening is, you know, a doubt gets raised in the case. The person is found incompetent to stand trial. And now that person should be going to a state hospital for competency restoration, but often they get stuck in the jails. And then another thing can happen, which is that the charges may be dropped for one reason or another. And then they're still stuck in the jails and they are conserved. So essentially, we have conserved people that are shadow institutionalized in jail. And it's difficult to know how large that population is. But you can see it here. I mean, it was the result of some reports about a year ago also. And if you look at the bottom of this document, case suspended, awaiting placement to a mental health facility. Those are the people that are in the Los Angeles County Jail. This report was from March 17th, so just a couple weeks ago. And you can see that there's a population of people that are in the jail with no criminal charges, and they are conserved. And so, you know, on top of our IMD beds, our shadow institutionalization in nursing homes, and our jails, it is quite possible that the number of people at any given time in California being impacted by institutionalization greatly exceeds, in at least raw numbers, the battle days of state hospitals. And then complicating this whole picture for California is that California is building a lot of institutions, right? Institutions under the federal definition, meaning that it's over 16 beds. It is primarily engaged in the treatment of people with mental diseases, right, which in the federal term and my understanding includes people with SUD. And so we've spent a lot of money in California to finance the construction of these facilities. And even those that are being officially constructed as unlocked facilities. So you might have a mental health rehabilitation center, 80 beds. It is not planned as a locked facility, but a bill passed in 2024 that allows counties to designate those for short-term institutionalization, psychiatric holds, or conservatorships in a locked placement and turn them into locked facilities. So it's kind of a canard, you know, how much of the infrastructure that California is financing and is building or has built is our IMDs, and how much of it is going to be locked. It's up in the air because it's all now convertible to being locked infrastructure to support short-term and long-term institutionalization, both locked and unlocked. And so you can go and look if you want to know for yourself. The Behavioral Health Continuum Infrastructure Program has a dashboard, and you can go see what's being built where. But you can see, if on this slide, like WellSpace Health in the Sacramento area is building a 200-bed SUD mental health treatment facility. It looks like mostly SUD. That's an IMD. County of Monterey, 100 beds. That's an IMD, etc. And there's been various rounds of BCHIP funding that have been appropriated or actually sent out the door in contracts to build facilities. But you can go see for yourself, how much of this is that. So this brings us back to the controversy pointed out in part 1 of the podcast, which is this conversation at both the state level and the federal level and across the country in all kinds of states related to whether Medicaid should have an IMD exclusion or not. In keeping with that, in the first Trump administration, Trump's Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, issued some guidance, and they said, look, we're going to waive the IMD exclusion. We will help you pay for IMDs for people with mental illness and SUD. We'll kick in half the cost under some conditions. There were some conditions attached to that. And California managed to obtain, just back in December, final approval for its BH Connect IMD waiver, IMD exclusion waiver. It's experimental, it's time limited. It is meant to take some of the pressure off those funds, those realignment dollars, those state funds that have to otherwise 100% fund IMDs, pay for IMDs without a federal match, without the assistance of federal health insurance. The experiment that is proposed is to see if people, if we pay for IMDs, if the federal government pays for half of an IMD stay for someone, will that reduce the amount of time that folks with mental illness or SUDs are spending in emergency rooms without a treatment bed? So that's what's proposed as the experiment to see, if you give us more money for IMDs, can we reduce ER boarding? But these waivers are also time limited. So I believe it's $1.9 billion from the federal government over 5 years to do the thing they don't usually do, which is kick in some dollars for people that are staying in IMDs. And again, the controversy is that they have one pool of funding and they don't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary patients. So, an IMD might include someone staying voluntarily at a 20-bed substance use disorder recovery center, or it might include, a person with serious mental illness being on multiple psychiatric holds at a, 200-bed acute psychiatric facility, acute mental hospital. And going on at the same time is there's currently a lot of reporting, a very troubling series, although this community was aware of it before, but about for-profit, private equity-owned IMDs in California and bad conditions and high profitability of these places related to bad conditions. So that's very much in the mix as well. And there's scrutiny from the federal government over private equity owned, hedge fund owned, locked and for-profit facilities, because that has been abused by some of these entities that have been sued. So this was a settlement from September 26, 2024, so not that long ago. Acadia Healthcare, which I believe is owned by Wad Capital Partners, which I think is a hedge fund in Tennessee, was sued by the federal government for placing people on bogus involuntary holds in order to bill insurance. So that is another side conversation in this whole controversy that's going on, in California, in other states, and at the federal level. So what I will wrap that up by saying, because it's now also in the news just in the last couple weeks, is the new federal administration looking to cut costs in Medicaid. And um, therefore, many of the things that California and other states have gotten as waivers out of the prior administration, or expansions of Medicaid out of the prior administration, including IMD waivers and other expansions of Medicaid, other ways that the federal government was kicking in more dollars to California in its Medi-Cal program for people with serious mental illness and SUD, is up in the air. The Republicans in the Congress are looking at very steep cuts to Medicaid. The form of those is not yet known, but it leaves things in a very difficult position for the state of California, because we have a large bill from IMDs to begin with. We've built a large number more, and how those are sustainable, um, having a payer for people to be in them, again, regardless of whether you're there voluntarily or involuntarily, is very much up in the air. And these things matter because those IMDs are expensive. And any way that the Trump administration goes with these things is bound to disrupt the balance that California has expected to have with its behavioral health transformation initiative. So that's all of Prop 1, the facilities that are being built, some of the new Medi-Cal expansions that are meant to pair with the changes to the Mental Health Services Act. All of it is very much called into question by all of these dynamics that are going on, both, cost pressures at the state level, cost pressures at the federal level, and also, scandals related to especially the for-profit, private equity owned, locked IMD that are increasingly being investigated for abusing their power, to bill insurance through involuntary care. Um, that was a lot, but hopefully it's helpful to people if they're seeing these things come up in the news right now, because they most certainly are. And a lot that has happened and is still sort of in implementation in California, relating to homelessness, SUD, mental illness, where people will live, the money that will take care of them, is all very much in flux. Thank you so much for joining us. And please, I guess you're supposed to say like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.